So welcome. This is the Plagiarism Workshop at the Boston University Theology Library. I'm Stacey Battles de Ramos. I'm the Access Services Librarian. I'll be presenting. I've titled the workshop, My Words Are Theirs, citing references correctly to avoid plagiarism, because I want to take it away from the big word plagiarism. That's a big scary word, right? Makes you think of academic misconduct, problems, consequences. So instead of thinking about consequences, let's think about our words, the words we're citing, and the integrity of our research. So this is a very general introduction to the idea of what plagiarism is, what it constitutes. Basically that you've got to give credit to get credit for your classes. We're going to cover what's expected in graduate level papers, university guidelines here at School of Theology and the DRTS, citation styles, tips for keeping your words separate, notes separate. We've got one more person. It's okay. And other resources that can help. So again, this is a very basic introduction to plagiarism, how to keep our words, their words that we're citing separate, to keep the integrity of our research. So the first thing, your thoughts count. Graduate level research needs to have three things. It needs to have your own idea driving the paper. I'm sure you're familiar with that already. It needs to have a dialogue with the thoughts and ideas of other scholars. And that's the important part. And if you're talking about any historical sources, any important primary sources, it's good to give small excerpts of them that sort of guide the dialogue. For example, if you're writing a paper about Ephesians 6, you're going to want to include the primary verses that you're directing them to, so that they don't have to pull out their own book to look. But the dialogue with the ideas and thoughts of past scholars, that's the important part. A lot of people, when they're doing graduate level research, when they're doing their master's, their doctorate work, they want to do this for their career, right? They want to get better. They want to show how good they can do. A lot of you are aiming to be professors, to go to ministry, whatever you need to do. So it's tempting to want to make yourself sound better. But really, in academic world, you sound better by who you know, not what you know. Saying that you invented gravity isn't going to make you as important as Sir Isaac Newton, because everybody knows that he discovered gravity. Now, saying that you know this happened and someone else came into the dialogue, sort of putting yourself in the history of theological thought and the history of philosophy by talking to scholars through their books, through their articles, commenting on it, critiquing it, what have you. That's what's going to make you important in academia. That's what's going to give you better grades. It's not about taking everything in and saying, it's yours. It's about showing that you know all these things, that you know who said it, that you know when they said it, and that you can come back with a thoughtful response, okay? So we have university guidelines about plagiarism. The School of Theology has one academic code of conduct. The graduate school has an academic code of conduct that covers your classes in the DRTS, Division of Religious and Theological Studies. I've posted both of them here. I'm not going to read through them word for word. This is the STH one. This is the GRS one. The STH one's a little longer. They both cover the same thing in the beginning. Includes copying answers, copying or restating work without citing, all the things you're used to. But I like that it goes into more detail, and it describes it as acts of commission or acts of omission. So you could commit plagiarism by saying that something is your own thought. But you can also commit plagiarism by not saying that it's someone else's thought. When you don't say where you got the idea, people think you're saying it's yours. So that's an act of omission. You may not mean to leave out the citation, but if you don't include it, that's technically plagiarism, okay? And it goes on, and I also like this part, colluding with someone, using footage that comes from another source, without permission or acknowledgement. So if you work with someone else on your paper and they write part of your paper, that's plagiarism, obviously. If you take your paper to be edited at the Writing Center, that's not plagiarism. That's copy editing. They'll fix the periods, the punctuation mark, what have you. But if you're working in a group and you're not supposed to be working in a group, that can be plagiarism. If you use an entire paragraph that your friend wrote, that's plagiarism. If you cite yourself, well, if you use your own work without citing yourself, that can be plagiarism. It can, yeah, yes, it can. So if you write an article last week, you wrote an article last week, you take a paragraph out of that and you resubmit it to a new journal this week as part of another paper, and you don't say where you published that, that's plagiarism. Even if it's your own work, because you have to say where, when it was, who said it, and it's already been said. You can get in trouble if you use one assignment in a fall semester class and you resubmit it in a spring semester class. Even if it fits what that assignment called for, you've already done it. You can't do it again, okay? Working with someone, editing, as I said, editing is not plagiarism. I mean, they're just helping you with the grammar, flow. It's still your words, your thought. They're telling you you should fix something, you fix it in your own words, right? If you write a paper and you get it translated and you don't cite the translator, that can be plagiarism. Because when we translate things, you have to reformulate them into another language. And so that's in somebody else's own words, even though it's a translation of your words. Okay? So you can't just use a translating service and have that work. This is the Graduate School Academic Code of Conduct. As I said, it sounds a lot like the beginning of the STH one, but the School Theology one goes further. Copying answers, restating someone else's work, oral or written. You can't just, include something someone talked about and assume because it was spoken it doesn't need to be cited. It does, and we'll get to that. So how do we cite? I'm sure you've done this before because it's a spring semester, so. So when we cite work, in theology there are two main citation guides. We have the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, Handbook of Style, and the Chicago Manual of Style, which is more commonly used across disciplines. If you're doing the theology and sociology masters, you should also be familiar with the American Sociological Association Style Guide and the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association. I've included the call numbers here. We have copies of each of these in our reference section. And we also have the Chicago Manual of Style online. Let me just show you that quickly. In the Boston University catalog, if you come down to the Chicago Manual of Style online, you can click the View It button. You'll be able to see that it's online. When you sign in, you can access it from home, any time of day, whatever you're working on, okay? So we're not just limited to reference books. If you're working on a paper at 2 a.m., the Chicago Manual of Style is working with you, okay? You can get to it. So that's how we cite. So where do we cite? What are things that we need to cite? We need to cite quotes from printed works or multimedia works, something you've heard someone say, the ideas of another person. Even if you're not using their specific words, we still need to cite that it was their idea. And if you're not sure, you can never, ever go wrong by citing. I have never seen anyone fail a paper for including too many citations. It just doesn't happen. You don't need to cite your own thoughts or experiences. The results of studies you have conducted, you do need to cite. which is interesting that that's up there. Common knowledge, you don't need to cite. I think that's supposed to be, you don't need to cite someone else for the results of studies that you have conducted. But you do need to cite your own work, as I said earlier. If you submit something in one article and you write another article and you include a paragraph from your first work, you need to say that was published in your first work. Common knowledge, things everybody knows. Things that come up in the newspaper that are not one specific instance or one specific person's thought. And I found at this website the Purdue OWL guides, which are interesting citation style guides I'll show you towards the end that can be very helpful, that Purdue has published online. They have what they call the 5 credible sources rule. So if you can think of 5 credible sources that all have the same idea, uncited, not pointing to a specific person, then that's common knowledge. So for example, the economic recession. We're in a recession right now, right? Or we just had one, depending on who you talk to. Who was the first person that called it a recession instead of a depression or anything else? We don't know. You might or might not be able to track it back to a newspaper article. You might be able to track it back to someone on Wall Street. Chances are at this point you can't anymore. But if you can think of 5 major newspapers that have all called it a recession without citing anyone, that's common knowledge. The theory that dinosaurs were killed by a meteorite. Okay, somebody thought of that to begin with, but it has taken so many twists and turns in popular culture and so many different variations that that's getting to be a common knowledge thing. So if you mention offhandedly, and when the dinosaurs were killed by meteorites, blah, 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 you probably don't need to cite that, okay? So that's common knowledge. If you can think of 5 instances that that comes up without being cited to any one person, it's probably a common knowledge thing. Okay? But separate instances in different locations, not in the same paper, then that's that person's work. Some more examples of things you need to cite. What you learned from the speaker you heard last Tuesday. So if you're in a lecture, you would still cite that idea, because that's that person's idea. Someone else's theory. A theory seems kind of vague, especially if it's a natural theory or a biological theory. You think, well, that's just the way science is, but you still need to cite it. If it was discovered or created by someone who comes up in their work, you need to cite it as their work. The assessment of church attendance statistics you read in the paper, yeah, things in the paper still need to be cited. They're very helpful with that. They put a byline in, and they also have citations at the end if they took that from another study. So you want to trace it back to the original study, the original research project, and cite the findings that you found, well, that they found, okay? Because you want the people who actually did that study to get the credit. So tips for keeping it separate. In your notes, you're going to want to keep organized, thorough notes, mark where you found each note, and keep your thoughts separate. If you have to write what you thought on a different page, you can do that. If you have to write it in a different color, you can do that. But I know, for one, 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning for a Monday morning paper, you may not remember a few hours later where you read something when you cited it. Or if you're really good and you started the paper 2 weeks ago, you may not remember what your notes were exactly 2 weeks before. I've seen people either write down the page number and then all the notes from that page, use different colors, different sides, whatever they need to do. I've seen people just, actually put footnotes in their notes. That may be a little extreme. But there are ways that you can mark it for yourself, organize it, pretty colored Post-its, whatever you need to do. Now in your paper, you're going to want to use in-sentence citations. Now, depending on what your professor wants you to use, that could be endnotes, that could be footnotes, but there's still going to be the marker at the end of the sentence pointing to that note. And you're going to want to make sure any sentence that has an idea or a quotation that's not yours has that. It's going to be a lot of sentences, sorry. That's just the way it works. After you write a draft, you can actually go through sentence by sentence, and that helps a lot. You can, tear it apart. Each sentence that doesn't have a footnote at the end, say, was this really mine? If you can say without a doubt that it was yours, you don't need to cite. But if that's explaining something further from a previous citation, or if it's giving a new idea that someone else had, or talking about what was brought up in a book, you should have cited something. If you use a phrase or a sentence that the author used repeatedly, then they have coined a phrase. Now this is the hardest one, because it may not seem like a phrase that is coined. But if there's a two-word group that they use again and again and again, then you're going to want to cite that as an idea that they had to put those two words together. For example, radical theology. That's a pretty common term. But if they're using it in a new way and redefining it in their paper, and then coining that to mean something to them, have given it a meaning that is beyond just theology that's radical, then you need to use that as their phrase. So you do need to cite that as theirs, and you kind of need to make it theirs, because it is theirs, and you're borrowing it at that point, okay? So again, two types of citations. You're either using their own words or you're summarizing what they said. So you're going to put their own words in quotation marks, always. Doesn't matter if it's just 2 words you borrowed from them or 3 lines. People do both. And you're going to want to put a footnote after that. But you can also summarize what they say. So if you're writing about what a book is saying, you still need to cite that. Do you guys have any questions about citing resources? That's more or less what we're going to cover today. But I've got some resources here that can help you. The SDH has a Writing Works office in the basement. I'm sure you've seen it. Our library has a reference desk. I know you've seen that because you walked past it just to come in here. And we have librarians at that from 11 to 3 on weekdays. You can always just walk up and ask a question about your references and your paper, the citations you're writing, how to find resources. We can answer all of those questions. I may have been the one that taught this workshop, but we all could have taught it. So everyone there is going to be fully equipped to help you, okay? You can also ask your professor or your TA. I mean, they're familiar with the work you're doing. They're probably familiar with most of the sources you've read. They've probably read them all themselves. And they're going to know what they're looking for in a paper from you. You can ask your academic advisor for help, and the International Students Office also has help on that, okay? Yes, you have a question?
Sometimes in one sentence, there are combined ideas of the authors or secondary sources and myself.
Okay. Yeah.
So the full idea of the sentence will not be of the authors, because I could also.
That is a great question. You would need to cite your own ideas if you had written them previously, but we're assuming in a paper that these are your fresh ideas. So sentences that are what you are trying to express don't need to be cited. But sentences that have the authors from another book or another journal article or whatever, that you're also citing them, you would actually still cite the whole sentence. So you would put a footnote at the end. You could do the author says ... and then a footnote, and then your thoughts. But in most cases, it's more smooth to put it at the end and more correct to put the citation at the end. You could put it mid-sentence like that if you had 2 authors. So you could say, Kelly says, her quotation marks, and the footnote, but Martha said it was quotations and footnote. So you could break it up like that, but since you don't need to cite your own ideas, and the phrasing in your sentence that I think, or just the conclusion you come to, you should put that citation probably at the end. I'd have to see the sentence, but you would still want to say that. Okay. Any other questions?
When borrowing some others' ideas
Yes.
and paraphrasing it, is there any technical limitation for that?
Yes. If you're paraphrasing anyone else's ideas, you have to cite it. And you have to cite each sentence where it came from, what the idea is. So each idea you bring from their work needs to have its own citation. Does that make sense? So even if you're restating in your own words, maybe in a paragraph, what they said in 600 words, that first sentence may be a summary of their introduction. So you're going to need to say that that came from their introduction. You know, you're going to have to pick apart your words, but each part of that comes from someone else's work. And people that are looking at that 600-page book, trying to find out if you correctly summarized that work, if that's where the ideas really came from, they need to know where to find them. So the point of the citations is to say, you know, they brought in that gravity exists on page 98, but then they went back and talked about velocity on page 110. And so it kind of, you have to keep the flow going so that they can see where it came from and see that it's not your idea really, but where they can find it in that work. Any other questions? Yes.
Resources from the discussion group. It is.
I'm sorry.
Resources from discussion group. Do I have to say that?
Resources from discussion group. Yes. Yes.
Then how do I state these resources from the discussion group? How name of the person?
It depends on what resources from the discussion group. If your discussion group brought in books and journal articles that they're talking about, then you need to cite those original books and journals. If your discussion group was discussing the book that you're writing a paper on, you shouldn't really be writing about what your discussion group said. It may direct your thoughts, but you should be pulling ideas from that book and your own interpretation, if that makes sense. So you should still be citing that. Maybe they were talking about chapter 6. So you're going to want to cite things from chapter 6. But in an academic paper, you really shouldn't be giving what your fellow students are saying because it's your paper. So you should be giving the critique that's yours. Does that make sense? Now, if someone in your group said something really interesting and it was their idea and it wasn't merely a restatement of the book, and you want to include that, you should cite them. If your professor said something extremely interesting in class, and that's good enough that you want to cite it, if you use it, you have to cite it.
Do I have to?
You don't always want to use it, but
do I have
if you
to
do,
spell
you
the
have to cite
student's name that the source is from?
it. Yes, if you're taking their idea, you have to put their name in. Yeah. Any other questions?
Could you please give us the PowerPoint you presented?
Yes, in fact, it's already out there on our library website. If we go to that really quickly, there's a page for tutorials.
Is this there for people in mind?
So under e-resources, tutorials, there is a new page where the library workshops are being posted. And because I already taught this one last week, it's already been posted. So the PowerPoint's right here if you ever need to look back at it. Okay?
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Did this sound a little bit?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Remember, if you ever have any questions, we do have lots of resources on campus that can help you. The library, your professors, the Writing Center, all of these resources. So you can find that PowerPoint and look them up, or you can just ask in the library. You don't have to write them down right now. But all of these are here to help you, okay?
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thanks.